What game-playing person hasn't dreamt of making their own game at some point? And even though the barriers to entry may be lower than ever these days, it remains a dream that few of us have been able to realize, whether it's due to lack of time, knowledge, or just a general intimidation. Which is exactly why I was so excited for Nintendo's Game Builder Garage, which isn't so much a game as it is a game-making toolset for you to make your own. It's basically Nintendo's version of Dreams, albeit with the games generally being simpler and far more limited in scope. Closer to say a Mario Party minigame rather than a full-scale adventure. Now, in case you're unaware, Game Builder Garage actually has earlier roots, taking the game-making foundation first introduced in 2019's Lab of VR's Garage Mode, and add some important new features like better tutorials, a greatly polished interface, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to actually share your games online for others to play. And you'll program these games yourself from start to finish, all without having to write a single line of code. It all works through the magic of Nodons, which are imaginary creatures that live inside your Switch and represent the core components of your games. There is about 80 of them in total, with each falling into one of 4 categories. Input for things like button presses, middle for calculations, output which dictates what happens afterward like playing a sound effect or ending the game, and finally objects which are the physical components of your game world, like the player character, enemies, among other things. And it's in how you link all these Nodon together that your program is created, dictating the logic of your game. Now that programming all takes place within the confines of a single massive workspace, where your programming and environmental layout exist side by side, such as how the player character's movement here is instructed by the nearby Nodon connected to it, which are otherwise invisible when actually playing the game. It's wonderfully simple in concept, and yet remarkably robust for what it is. But that isn't to say it's without its fair share of quirks and complexities. Thankfully, Game Builder Garage includes a series of tutorials which walk you through how to create 7 different games. Most of which aren't particularly great, mind you, but that's okay since it's more about teaching you the tools to make better ones yourself. Bob, a Navi-like helper, walks you through each game step by step, with the various Nodon chiming in along the way with cute quips and words of encouragement. The entire thing is just so darn charming, with each Nodon having its own distinctive look and manner of speaking. I especially loved how the constant Nodon would invoke a sense of existential dread with nearly every comment, whereas the teleport Nodon came across as mysterious but enlightened. Their unique looks and personalities help reinforce their purpose, making it easy to discern various parts of your program at a glance. Most of the tutorials take upwards of an hour or even longer, and they're practically essential if you have no formal programming knowledge like myself. Although they're technically not required beyond the first lesson, but I do strongly recommend you play them all. Just maybe not all at once. The tutorials, for better or worse, are essentially follow the leader style, with Bob telling you exactly what to do every step of the way. Which at least ensures you can't get lost, but it also doesn't guarantee that you actually understand what it is that you're doing. Checkpoint challenges that appear between lessons try to mitigate this somewhat by providing a broken game that you have to fix. It's actually a pretty clever idea, and some of the puzzles are rather challenging, though I'm not sure if I really gathered all that much from them. While the tutorials do an adequate job of explaining the fundamentals, they do gloss over some of the smaller steps, like when I was tweaking some individual Nodon settings. I often found myself wanting to pause the tutorial in order to play around in the programming myself to better understand each step. But there's no room for experimentation here, as literally every option is locked except the one that you need. Thankfully, each tutorial is broken up into multiple segments, with most of them lasting around 10 to 15 minutes. And it's worth taking a break at times to better explore what you've learned. Now sure, you probably will encounter some stumbling blocks along the way, such as when experimenting with Nodons that you haven't yet been taught. Like how I spent over an hour fiddling with a 3D camera. But that's actually where I found the tutorials most useful, when it was filling in the blanks for things I had already attempted. Ultimately, the best way of learning is by doing, which also happens to be far more fun. And frustrating. Make no mistake, while Game Builder Garage might be simple by programming standards, it's still a remarkably complicated piece of software, as I discovered in trying to make a Pac-Man-like game. When I tried giving these UFOs, Pac-Man ghosts, some incredibly rudimentary AI. And let me tell you, this entire process had me saying words that sounded similar to Pac-Man, but most definitely weren't Pac-Man. So my solution ended up being to have the UFO constantly move in one direction until it either hit an invisible trigger or it came to a stop up against a wall. At which point, a random number generator kicks in to choose a new direction for it to travel in, until it repeats the next time. It might sound simple, but check out my coding for it. Yeah! This darn thing nearly broke my brain trying to figure it out. but I also felt like a complete genius afterward, even if there probably is a better, simpler solution. In some ways, Game Builder Garage shows how programming can be the ultimate puzzle game. Only you're solving puzzles of your own creation. But my little Pac-Man project did highlight some of the shortcomings of the game's tutorials, in that they don't really address some important areas, like the aforementioned enemy AI, which is a pretty key part of a lot of games. Now, while I did enjoy the process of figuring out my own in this instance, which maybe is the point, I felt completely out of my element as to how to achieve more complicated behavior. But maybe I'll figure it out down the line. The tutorials also don't address how to use every Nodon in the game, leaving it to Allison's guide section, who's basically Bob's counterpart, which contains a few extra lessons, along with a Nodon encyclopedia that breaks down every Nodon in the game, which, while useful, is often written a little too clinically for my tiny little brain to fully comprehend how that translates into actual game mechanics. Like with this extending box, which doesn't actually interact with the things that it touches. I'm sure it has some use, but what that is remains a complete mystery to me. Some examples of how to use each Nodon, or better yet, video demonstrations, would have gone a long way in helping me understand their exact purpose. But the somewhat ambiguous nature of it all perhaps underscores how powerful Game Builder Garage can be, with a nearly infinite amount of possibilities. Especially when you factor in they can even create your own textures, which can be mapped to all kinds of objects, including characters, which can completely transform the look of what otherwise might be a fairly generic looking game, especially since most games will likely be drawing upon the same core 40 fancy objects. Now, the texture creator would definitely benefit those who already have a knack for art, as this simple road texture is already pushing the limits of my skill. I just wish this tool had a few more options available, like being able to automatically draw simple shapes, or being able to save your texture to a central directory that other games you create can draw upon. In any case, the interface itself is generally simple and snappy, allowing you to easily drop in Nodon via the 4 buttons in the corner, connect them by drawing a line, and then hitting the play button to test it all out. Although making finer adjustments can start to get a bit tricky when you have a ton of Nodon within a confined space, especially when trying to control the cursor with a standard controller. But thankfully, the game supports multiple control options, including using a standard USB mouse when docked, which is way better than the standard button controls, letting you zoom in and out with a scroll wheel, and quickly undoing or redoing with the back and forth buttons. Of course, you can use a touchscreen when in handheld mode, which is actually my preferred method of playing the game. I actually used a hybrid of the touchscreen for quick zooms and connecting Nodon, whereas I use the button controls for some finer inputs and easily testing my game. Although the Nodon menus are easy to navigate thanks to the icons, the sub-menus look awfully dull by comparison, like this plain text list of all the 3D objects. Icons for each of them would have been so much better. Oh, and oddly, while the tutorials have music to accompany them, there is none to be heard when creating your own games, making it unsettlingly quiet. Though there are thankfully plenty of musical options for when you're actually playing your own game. In general, the interface works best when designing 2D games, like for side-scrolling or top-down experiences, as it grows exponentially more complicated when dealing with a proper 3D environment, requiring me to constantly hop in and out of the game to either test object placement or figuring out what angle my camera should be at. You'll also have to flip between the Y and Z axis to denote each object's actual location in 3D space, which can get pretty confusing pretty fast, especially with how a Nodon might be near another on one axis, but much farther away when viewed from the other. It can also lead to the issue of a ton of Nodons appearing to be stacked on top of each other from one viewpoint, requiring you to select it from the other one before swapping back. It's a little surprising that there isn't a 3D editing option available, considering Labo VR had exactly that. And I really can't fathom why it was scrapped in Game Builder Garage. Furthermore, Labo VR had 64 Garage games built in, whereas Game Builder has 0 beyond the 7 that you build yourself. Now sure, most of those 64 games weren't exactly amazing, but it was fun to try them out and see what was possible, and even explore the coding behind them to try and learn a few new tips. But I'm assuming Nintendo thought it was unnecessary this time, considering that you can finally share and play other people's creations both locally and online. Uploading a game spits out a code they can then give to others for them to check out for themselves, and they can even edit the game further and repost it if they want to. It's a pretty simple process, but it is disappointing that there isn't a Mario Maker-like hub for you to freely explore and download games without having to consult an outside source. It's also a bit of a drag that there's no way to provide in-game feedback either. No likes, no comments, nothing. Oh, and you also should be aware that Nintendo may delete your uploaded game if no one's played it in 1 year's time. At the end of the day, it's easy to say that the only limits are your own imagination. And that's because it's mostly true. Now there obviously are some hard limits here, like the 512 Nodon count, but I haven't even gotten close to approaching that with my games so far. But get this, Even if you do run up against a 512 limit, there's actually a nodon that instructs the game to load up another game that you specified upon reaching the goal, essentially allowing you to create one giant ongoing adventure. Just make sure that your friends download each game before starting the first in the series. Game Builder Garage is an incredibly clever and compelling game-making toolset, which can also be annoyingly vague and complicated at times. It's pretty amazing they can get a game prototype up and running in just a few minutes, although making it play will likely take quite a bit longer. And it has legitimately elicited the strongest reactions I've had to a game all year, from intense frustration at my inability to make something work, to near euphoria once I finally did. It's ostensibly designed for gamers of all ages, but I can only imagine how much younger players may struggle with some aspects if it gave even a fully grown adult a headache at points. But hey, maybe it's even better suited for younger minds. For me, Game Builder Garage ultimately feels like the halfway point between the more primitive mode found in Labo VR and what could be a truly phenomenal product. But even in its somewhat uneven state, I like it, and I hope that it'll keep growing on me as I become more knowledgeable and confident in my game creation skills. And hey, any game that lets me recreate Blast Corps is an instant win in my book. It's a surprisingly powerful toolset, and I truly can't wait to see what all of you are able to make with it, especially now that I can actually play those creations too. And with that, thank you so much for watching GameXplain's review of Game Builder Garage. Make sure to click that subscribe button and ring the bell for more reviews and everything else Nintendo Switch 2. We'll catch you later. Bye everyone!